Hello Year 10, so today we are going to look at another romantic poem from the anthology by a man called William Wordsworth, whose name you will hopefully recognise from the documentary that you watched at the start of term. So as always, we're just going to quickly revise some of our key vocabulary. So I'd like you to think back to last term or even last year at the start of year 9. We looked at this idea of what a workhouse was. So what were the workhouses and how did Charles Dickens view them? Last lesson, we focused on what an elegy was when we were looking at To Autumn. So in what way is To Autumn an elegy? Our new word today is rapture, which is found in our new poem. Rapture is a feeling of intense pleasure or joy. So it's an incredible happiness, rapture. I'd like you to please pause the video quickly and jot down that definition. So a feeling of intense pleasure or joy or, happiness. So why might the romantic poets view being in a natural surrounding as a time of rapture? Why would that make them so extremely happy? So pause the video, have a go at answering those 3 questions, please. So the workhouses were created by the government as a result of the Poor Law, a law passed in 1834 to try and address the extreme levels of poverty and homelessness and crime. They were big houses or buildings that had been converted into essentially dormitories, really. So if you were poor and you had nowhere to live, you couldn't afford to feed or clothe yourself or your family, you could choose to voluntarily go into a workhouse. If you were part of a family, the men, the women and the children would not be together, you would be in a separate workhouse. And the key really is in the word. It is a house of work. You were given a bed, often sharing with a stranger, in a great big sort of room full of beds. You were given food, but it wasn't of very good quality and it was just about enough to let you survive. And in exchange for this charity, she says sarcastically, if that doesn't convey itself over the medium of recorded lessons, they made them work for often 13 hours a day, doing very hard manual labour. They were essentially viewed by many as slave labour camps for the poor, punishing the poor. Now, Dickens absolutely loathed and despised and hated the workhouses. This is because his own father, when Dickens was a child, was sent to a debtor's prison, which was a bit like a workhouse, only you could be forced to go in there because you were in debt. And Dickens' mother and younger siblings all had to go there as well. Dickens, because he was older, he was 12, was able to go out to work, and he was forced to work in a factory blackening bottles. Eventually, his dad inherited some money and was able to pay off his debt, and they were able to re-establish themselves to have a fairly decent life. But Dickens was traumatised and mentally scarred from that experience, and it gave him a lifelong sympathy and empathy for the poor. And that's absolutely crucial to understand about Charles Dickens, because all of his books, including A Christmas Carol, focus on creating that sympathy for the poor. So an elegy is something that is very sad and very mournful, and we see that in To Autumn because we know that To Autumn is a poem that shows the human life cycle of life into death, represented by the seasons of autumn into winter, and it ends in quite a sad but gentle and reflective way of someone passing into death. So the romantic poets, as we know, worshipped nature. Either nature was their god, or through nature you could become one with God, for those early romantic poets like Blake and Wordsworth who were Christian. So they were their most intensely happy when they were surrounded by nature. And what we see in the poem today is the poet as a young boy experiencing that rapture of being in nature. So if you can please pause the video. Today we're going to explain how Wordsworth uses language to present nature and childhood in the excerpt from the prelude. So we're not just focusing on nature, like Into Autumn, we're also going to look at how childhood is presented. Now, the reason why it's called excerpt from the prelude is that, as we're going to learn, the prelude is a very, 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 very long poem. This is only a little section of that poem. That's why it's called an excerpt. So by the end of the lesson, you'll know the context of the poem, how Wordsworth uses language to present nature, and how Wordsworth uses language to present childhood. So pause the video and get that knowledge goal down. Now, I'm mainly going to write about the context on the visualizer in a minute, but something to understand about William Wordsworth: he was one of the early Romantic poets, writing at the same sort of time as Blake, rather than Shelley and Keats and Byron, who were known as the second generation Romantic poets. He was one of the early ones. The Prelude is a very, very, very long poem, which is an autobiographical account of Wordsworth's early years and childhood living amongst nature in the Lake District where he grew up. Now, an autobiography is when you're writing about your own personal experiences. So he's not just making this up, he's writing about his own personal childhood experiences in nature. And that's what this long poem is about. Essentially, his intentions in writing this poem is that the prelude was supposed to be a very, very long introduction to an even longer poem about nature. And the whole point of the prelude is really Wordsworth justifying to the reader, or whoever's going to read it, why he has such a unique and close relationship, a close personal relationship with nature. He's trying to justify why he's qualified to write about nature, because of how close he is with nature and how much his childhood and his person was shaped by his childhood experiences in nature. So viewing this poem as a sort of justification for what was going to be a much longer poem to come after it is really his intentions here. So we're going to switch over now and we'll write down some contextual information and I will annotate the poem. Now, you have or should have a typed version of the prelude. I would recommend, unless you have a printer, to actually edit that document and do your notes within that. So, as always, we're going to write a little bit about the context at the bottom. So we're going to write down that he was an early Romantic poet. We should all know by now what that means. Poem is from a long autobiographical poem about his childhood experiences of nature. He grew up in the Lake District. Is an incredibly stunningly beautiful part of the country if you've ever been. You know, he spent most of his adult life living in the countryside. You know, he was a very quite isolated man, Wordsworth. He deliberately isolated himself and was happiest really being alone in a natural setting. One of the people he was closest to in his life was, and who he did live with as an adult, was actually his sister. But we're not going to go into that too much here. The thing to remember in terms of his Romantic beliefs is not just about nature, but also childhood. Remember, early romantics, and Wordsworth felt this just as keenly as Blake, they believed that being a child was the ideal state for a person to be in because you're innocent. Wordsworth hated this rise of technology and science that tried to explain the great mysteries of the world. To the Romantic poets, they wanted certain things to remain a mystery. They enjoyed the mystery of the world. And so they, weren't fans of this science, moving science and technology that sought to explain these great mysteries. And that's another reason why they looked back all the time, looked back to the past, to classical mythology, looked back to childhood. They viewed the past as very much a more idyllic, ideal time than their present and what was going on in society. So, excerpt from the Prelude. We're not going to worry too much about the title, but remember, as I said to you, this is just a little part of what is a much, much, much longer poem that would take us forever to read. So, and in the frosty season. So we know that it's set in winter. When the sun was set, so we know it's early evening. So winter in early evening is quite dark, and visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blazed. Now, picture an old-fashioned Christmas card. It's snowy, it's a countryside, and you can see this nice shining light in all these old-fashioned windows of these old-fashioned cottages. That's the image that Wordsworth's trying to put forward to us here. In all of these little windows of these cottages, this light is shining through. So it's a very, pretty, I want to say idyllic, has two L's, country image. Here it's like when you're outside in the cold and you look and your house is all cozy and warm. It's creating again that very sort of positive, very comforting sort of atmosphere. I heeded not the summons. So his parents, or mother probably, is telling him to come in for tea. That's what the summons is, but he's ignoring it. So he's ignoring his parents asking him to come home. Probably, tea time. It's dark, not time to be playing with your friends outside anymore. But he heeded not the summons, so he's ignoring it. Happy time it was indeed for all of us. To me, it was a time of rapture. So here's our new word. He remembers this childhood time as being very happy. It was a time of rapture, of intense joy, not just for him, but for all of us, all of the children, because this is what the Romantic poets believed children should be doing, not shut up reading dusty books in schools or, being made to work up chimneys or in factories. They should be free to commune with nature in that beautiful, innocent, creative, childlike, inspirational way. So we're really seeing the sort of positive impact nature has on children here. Clear and loud, the village clock told 6. So it's, 6 in the evening. I wheeled about, proud and exulting, like an untied horse that cares not for its home. Now, what he's doing here, And we find that out by being shod with steel. He's ice skating. So again, back when it actually got cold enough in this country for not only the ice rivers to freeze, but them to freeze enough to ice skate on, that's what him and his friends are doing. They're ice skating. So like an untired horse that cares not for his home. It's a simile here. Remember, a simile is when two things are compared. So he is like a horse that isn't tired and doesn't want to go home. You know, so he just wants to stay and play forever, really. So all shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice. So what we have here is sibilance. Sibilance is a repetition of the s sound. We hissed along the polished ice. So what is quite interesting here is that sound is actually imitating the sound of the ice skates. So I'm just going to put that here. So sibilance is a bit like alliteration for those of you that may not have heard that before, but it's the repetition of a s, and that sound can not just be at the start of a word, but here, hissed along the polished ice. And even though it's a C, it makes a s sound. So what this is doing is it's imitating the sound of the ice skates. They're hissing. It's a very sensory image because it's creating this sound of the hiss of the ice skates along the ice. In games confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack loud bellowing, and the hunted hare. So what he's just referring to here is woodland pleasures, is they're acting out a fox hunt. Now, hopefully to most of us, the whole idea of, you know, viciously hunting down foxes and getting dogs to tear them apart is something we find quite disgusting. But obviously in those days, they didn't view that like that. So really, they're just chasing each other around the ice. You know, children endlessly love just chasing each other and playing it, don't they? So that's essentially what they're doing. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle. So again, this idea of not a voice was idle, all of the children are laughing, you know, and happy, but they're making a right old loud noise of it. If you ever walk past a busy play park, just the noise of children is pretty extraordinary, really. Now, at this point, we have a mood and atmosphere change. You know, the poem is pretty straightforward up to this point, but with this semicolon, the mood and atmosphere does sort of change here. And with the din is the noise of the children. Meanwhile, the precipices rang aloud. Now, what I want you to imagine is a camera has been zoomed in on these children in this little village skating on this ice. There's a nice little village clock. There's the nice little thatched roof country cottages around with, you know, their parents inside cooking dinner with their nice warm fires. And then I want you to imagine suddenly that this camera zooms out. And it zooms out, and what you can see is around this little village are these huge sorts of hills. if you like, and mountains. And the Lake District is a place with lots of sort of hills and mountains. And what Wordsworth is doing here is he's zooming out and really focusing in on what is around this village. So the precipice is, you know, the edge of a cliff or a mountain. So I always say to students, you need to visualize now, we've zoomed out, that the light and the sound of that village is distant. And instead what you've got is these huge mountains sort of either side. And the din, the noise of the children is echoing sort of against the edges of these mountains. The leafless trees and every icy crag tinkled like iron. So what we have with leafless trees here is we have this sort of imagery of death here. And we can see that suddenly the words that Wordsworth is using do really counteract this very happy, innocent, positive mood, focusing on these sort of distant, cold, slightly spooky, you know, edges of these big, scary looking cliffs with the noise echoing. The trees are leafless. There's the sound of the icy branches are sort of tinkling together like iron, this sort of cold metal. While the distant hills into the tumult, that's the noise, sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed. So of melancholy, you know, away from the village, the sound turns, you know, sad and sort of mournful. So if you're up close watching these children, you may sort of laugh along with them. But actually, as you zoom out and away from this village, that noise dies down to the point where it actually sounds quite sad. While the stars eastwards were sparkling clear, and in the west, the orange sky of evening died away. So we have, you know, it's full nighttime now. So you've got this sort of imagery of darkness. And we know from looking at To Autumn that day into night can tend to symbolise this idea of, you know, getting older or life into death. So the minute we zoom away from this village into this sort of quite sinister countryside around, the mood and the atmosphere changes. We start to have imagery of death and sort of imagery of this sort of lifelessness. Now, here is the way to interpret this. This change of mood and atmosphere, it represents the loss of innocence of a child. When they grow up, they have to deal with, you know, the real world. And, you know, people like Wordsworth that very much isolated themselves in this sort of country setting, they very much wanted to shut themselves away from that world and almost prolong that innocence experience of childhood. So the way I would interpret this poem here is that this change, when we suddenly zoom out and away from this childhood innocence, what that change represents or symbolises, remember is our fancier word for represents, is that these children will one day lose their innocent enjoyment of nature. They'll grow up and have to deal with the real world, you know, a world which is trying to explain the mysteries of life, a world which is trying to, you know, shut children up in schools and sort of kill their love of nature, make them focus on work and jobs And, you know, prolonging that childhood state is something we know the Romantic poets wanted to do. So I'm going to stop the lesson there. I'm trying as much as I can to limit, you know, what we're actually asking you to do in these lessons, because I know so many of you are feeling sort of overloaded and overwhelmed at home. So today I just want you to focus on getting this poem annotated. In our next lesson, we're going to be doing a quiz, which will be on your Teams group, which is going to test your knowledge of this poem and also to autumn. As always, if you have any questions, please do let your class teacher know, and I'll see you next time.